Alright, what's going on, everybody? Your SI Tannen here, and today I'm going to be talking about the final exam readings and the talking points. So, if you haven't already read the readings, I would do that first because I'm going to just be talking about the main points, but I won't be able to go into them too in depth today. Luckily for you, though, they are just transcripts of TED Talks, so if you haven't read them, then just go watch the TED Talks and then come back here. Though, like I said, I'm going to give you some just quick main ideas from both the readings. So to start with, we have Dan Ariely's Are We in Control of Our Own Decisions? So I think the biggest takeaway is that he expresses that our decisions are almost never entirely of our own choosing, like entirely, right? He says that the way society is designed, for example, the DMV form he talks about, it's actually a society that makes decisions for us constantly, and we only really make superficial decisions after all the underlying ones are said and done. He also hints at something big, which is that even if we know these sorts of decision making skews, we don't think that we ourselves will be. I said biased, though that might not be the best term, but in my sense, it kind of is biased. So he states it as like hard to intuit. Excuse me. That is the concept that we will always think we have full agency or are, quote, in the driver's seat, even when we're not. So going back to that DMV form, right? It actually ends up being the act of ticking the box that chooses for a lot of people whether or not they become an organ donor, right? So even if we know that concept is a thing and we know that design might play an element in how we make decisions, we don't think we're susceptible to it, right? Lastly, he discusses that we don't actually know our preferences that well. So having people design things in a way to help us choose, it does in some senses take away our agency, but it also lifts some of that mental burden so it can be easier for us to choose. Excuse me. Going on to Ruth Chang's How to Make Hard Choices. I'm not going to hit all these points because I don't think they're all the most important, but feel free to pause and read them. Obviously, she makes the distinction between what's an easy choice, what's a hard choice, also between big and small choices. And she claims that often when dealing with hard choices, we assume that one alternative actually is better than the other. But we think we're just too stupid to know which is which, so instead we often take the easiest or the safest option, or the one that we're most familiar with. And we'll hit on this point when it comes to assumptions, right? Because that's something we assume. She compares hard choices to measurable values. So she kind of compares the idea of hard choices to scientific choices, right? Or scientific reasoning. And she says when comparing two subjects' weight, right, there can only be three outcomes: less than, greater than, or equal to, right? So something is either less than, weighs more, or is the same weight as something else. But with hard choices, the values being weighed can't be quantified. To Chang, hard choices present two options that are, quote, on a par. So she kind of introduces this fourth idea, this concept that, they might be similar in value overall, but different in their kinds of values. Also, we'll talk about this when it gets to values. But yeah, this problem of having hard choices, according to Chang, that are on a par, is actually the best part of life because it gives us a chance to prove who we are to ourselves. We create our own reasons to make that choice, and we become the author of our own lives, right? So, getting into these talking points, illusions. So they're directly discussed in Ariely's TED Talk, and he starts with talking about visual illusions at the end of page 1 into page 2, but I think that's more so a segue into kind of these cognitive illusions. And then again, going back to that DMV example, he shows how even when people are given an option for yes or no, in both cases, it ends up being the act of ticking a box that decides if they will be an organ donor or not, right? So it's kind of a decision-based illusion. So it's not so much talked about in TED's talk, or in Chang's TED Talk, but the example I found, or the best example from, that I could find at least, is that she discusses the idea that adding $500 to the banker job doesn't actually make that job better than the graphic artist job. So it's kind of an illusion to think that one option during a hard choice can be quantitatively better than another one. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Also, good time to pause and say, these are, again, my ideas, my concepts. If you made a connection that I didn't, great. If one of my connections doesn't really make sense to you, that's totally fine. Just, don't use it. Make your own connections. You don't have to take everything I say as gospel. Please don't. So, yeah, I just want to put that out there because, you still got to do some work yourself, right? So, going on to the decision-making process, Ariely says that we should really embrace pre-made decisions for ourselves, and having others sometimes choose for us because it takes the pressure off of ourselves. Chang says that making hard decisions allows us to choose the type of person we want to be. So it's kind of how we decide things that determine our narrative, our story, and something that I kind of gathered later was that, as I see it, Chang says that we don't want to be afraid of taking a risk, or we shouldn't be scared of taking a risk, because, right, if we're always choosing that safe option, then we're not actually really making our own decisions, or we're only ever making the safe decisions. So this point was kind of funny to me because like I feel like the decision making process is super broad and it's just what's talked about in both TED Talks. So that's kind of the main points from both TED Talks. Moving on to values, Early doesn't talk about values specifically and how we interpret them, but he does discuss the idea that outside factors or designs help determine our values. Right? He talks about that middle option. So even when that middle option in that one case was like completely unnecessary, it helped people decide which option around it they wanted. Chang says that we need to understand when it comes to our choices the different values they offer and which ones are most important to us. So going back to that idea of a job, right? If there's two jobs that overall might be the same in values, we have to really look at what sort of values they offer. So do we value more money over being able to work from home? Or do we value a short commute time more than a diverse team of coworkers? So these are just a couple examples of where, right, one person might be like, oh, this job has, offers me $5,000 more. I'm definitely going to take the money. But the other job, you're able to work from home and somebody might value being able to work from home more, right? Other people might really want a lot of diverse coworkers, so they're willing to, travel for longer periods of time, whereas other people really just want a short commute time, and so that's what they value more. So I think values are really, they're definitely talked about a lot in Chang's piece. Assumptions. So Airly, I think there's like a perfect quote. There's actually a couple in there, but this is the one I found. He says, quote, "But when it comes to us, we have such a feeling that we're in the driver's seat, such a feeling that we're in control and we are making the decision, that it's very hard to even accept the idea that we actually have an illusion of making a decision rather than an actual decision." So that is to say, we assume we have made all our decisions with our own agency when that's not really true. Chang says that we can't assume that hard choices are scientific endeavors. Again, there is no quantifiable better option in hard choices. Empowerment. So it's not directly mentioned in Airly's ideas, but something that I think is very empowering is his concept that we should understand our cognitive limitations, right? The same way that we understand our physical limitations. So I, give the example like, say you have a bad knee, right? So you know what sorts of exercises are within your limits. If you knew the same sorts of limits in terms of your cognitive ability, you would know when to outsource for help when making a decision. And that's empowering because it lets us keep moving forward, right? So I say no beard and ass because if you've heard the story, right, there's a donkey who's staring at like two stacks of hay that are equally appealing, and they both just look so enticing that the donkey can't decide and it starves to death. So in this case, if we know we can't decide which one is better, then we outsource to a friend, right? And if that friend helps us make a decision, it helps us keep moving forward. And even though it feels like you're letting up some of your agency, at least, you're not starving to death. And that's empowering. Chang's ideas about, I think, being the author of our own lives, super empowering. The idea that it's, how we decide what values are important to us when making hard choices. And that's what makes us, right? Rational, irrational decision making. Airly uses the examples of trips to Rome versus Paris to explain that people can be influenced to make different decisions when their choices are paired with irrational options. So it's that irrational option that gives them the confidence to know what they want, right? So what was the option? It was like, oh, you go to Paris, you could go to Rome, or you could go to Rome without coffee. And then it's like, oh, well, I definitely want to go to Rome. So it's kind of this irrational element that gives people clarity in what they want. Chang expresses that if we only made rational decisions, say if hard options could be quantified, even though they can't, right? If they could be, we'd all wear black socks instead of pink, and we'd eat cereal for breakfast instead of donuts, right? So as I see it, Chang is saying elements of irrationality when it comes to hard choices is what gives our lives variety. Going back to that values idea, right? Say in this, example, say one job offers $10,000 more than, another job. So say you're looking for the same position, right? Say you're trying to be a banker, but one banking, company offers you $10,000 more, but the other banking company somehow allows you to work from home. Some people might be like, well, I really just need to work from home, Maybe they have kids. Maybe there's, there's a lot of other factors that kind of go into that. But a lot of people will be like, oh, it's totally irrational to choose the working from home if you could have been offered 10,000 more dollars. But to you, right, going back here, it's not irrational. So in a way, you decide what's irrational or not, according to Chang. Limitations, cognitive. So discussed explicitly in Airley's piece, he says, quote, we understand our physical limitations and we build around them. But for some reason, when it comes to the mental world, we design things like healthcare and retirement and stock markets, we somehow forget the idea that we are limited. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Not so explicit in Chang's piece, but the best connection I could find is that, she believes we limit ourselves from living to the fullest when we default to safe choices, right? So safe choices become a cognitive limitation. And as I understand it, right, it's that element of risk taking that becomes a way of breaking those limits, right? Like we shouldn't be scared to take risks. We should break those cognitive limits. Normative powers, agency. So again, Airley basically argues that we don't always have complete agency, but that's okay, right? According to him, we should know our limits so we know when to let others help us decide or to decide for us. Explicitly mentioned by Chang, she says, now, or quote, now people who don't exercise their normative powers in hard choices are drifters. And I wanted to note that normative powers is actually a concept made by Chang that says, we have the power to create normative reasons for ourselves. So it's that idea that we create meaning for ourselves. That's exercising our normative powers, right? Self-invention, defining oneself, not really talked about in Airley's piece, but the best connection I can make is that when outsourcing help, or that outsourcing help itself, when making a tough decision, although it feels like it's limiting one's self-invention, right? Because, I have to ask somebody else for help, I'm not making my own decision. If that outsourcing helps you choose an unsafe, right, option, it actually does become a way of bolstering self-invention because now you're exploring paths that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that is self-invention. To Chang, right, again, that quote, we might say that we become the authors of our own lives, she's very big on the idea that it's how we end up making these specifically hard decisions or hard choices that determine the character we become in the world. Last point, external factors. In Airley's work, he notes that external factors can help us make a tough decision. And for example, going back to that DMV form, it's the person who designs the form that can help us choose to become organ donors. So that designer was an external factor. So from what I gather, Airley would say that we should design the world so that these external factors facilitate people in everyday circumstances to make easier choices. It still might be a hard decision or a hard choice, but, if we design the world in such a way, we might lift some of that burden off of ourselves to make it slightly easier. Last but not least, external factors, I'm not gonna lie, could not find much in Chang's piece because she really focuses on this internal landscape and this internal understanding when it comes to hard choices. Again, we are the authors of our own lives. It's very individualistic. So if anything, what I garner is that Chang is saying we should make decisions to define who we are regardless of external pressures. Though I note here that I'm sure she would argue, that certain external factors, say family dynamics, economic status, disabilities, can impact or impair one's abilities to make choices. I'm sure she would agree with that. I just think she didn't really end up discussing it. So in that sense, this very last point, in Chang's piece, I couldn't find anything. So hopefully you can find something. And I'm going to outsource the choice to you so you can choose which quote works best for that. But yeah, hopefully besides that, I gave you some points about each one. I'm also going to post this PowerPoint separately so you can go back and just look at my notes. But yeah, just want to say good luck. I should note that, right, the final exam is entirely on you guys. You cannot ask for help from anybody. But definitely not me and Professor, right? So as soon as you get the questions, it's all up to you. But leading up to that, part of this presentation was to help you guys really understand the both of the exam readings. So get as familiar with them as you can, feel super confident, feel like you know it like the back of your hand, whatever analogy you want to use. And that way, when those questions come, you're not caught off guard, right? So yeah, if anything, if any questions pop up, if there was a certain point that you want more explanation of, feel free to email me. You know where to find me. And yeah, I will see you guys in class. All right, bye-bye.